Yoga philosophers love to define what yoga is. And this is maybe because it's quite intangible, but also broad. And there's a really rich and long history of yoga. But also maybe because it's kind of fun to try and make the abstract concrete, which is, I think, to a large extent, what yoga is about, at least in some aspects of it. So I wanted to look at probably the most common definition that you probably heard of yoga, which is that yoga means union. And of course, you want to ask union of what with what, but we'll come back to that in a wee second. So if you look it up, you look up the word yoga in a Sanskrit dictionary, then you'll see that it comes from the verbal root yoj, which means to join, hence linking yoga union. But it also has a huge, extensive listing of other things like tricks and potions and the actual yoke, which joins the chariot and the horse, and many, many, many other things, because Sanskrit is a language where one word can have many meanings. And this word yoga, since the beginning, has always had quite a broad application. Um, so, but if we look at the texts and the traditions, then you'll start to see that yoga is defined in lots of different ways, which are actually quite practical and which can help us to actually have something to bring into our everyday life and into our practice. So let's look at some of these things. The first time we see yoga used in a text to refer to like this psychospiritual practice is in the Katha Upanishad, where it says that they consider, I'm reading the quote, they consider yoga to be the firm restraint of the senses. Then one becomes undistracted, for yoga is the arising and the passing away. So we can see how it kind of is related to the idea of union, because we have the idea of bringing the senses together in a state of restraint. But it's clearly not as concrete as yoga is the union of something, something. So what happens after that? If we go a little bit later to the classical, so-called classical yoga period, and the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, where Patanjali codifies into this very dense text the tradition of yoga as it has been practiced by many different people up until that point. And so he kind of like makes it into a system, systematizes it in this text. So in the second verse of the sutras, Patanjali says, Yogas chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is the cessation or the stilling or suspension of the whirlings and fluctuations of the mind. Okay, so is that anything to do with union? Not explicitly from this sentence. And in fact, if you look at the rest of the text, you'll find that for Patanjali, yoga is actually about disunion. It's all about, in chapter 2, he says that the cause of suffering is the very strong union between the seer, so that's you, and the seen, so that's the material world. So when you're overly attached to your possessions, or even to your thoughts, or even to anything basically that is going to pass away, which is everything, then that causes suffering. And so throughout the text of the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali is talking about ways to detach yourself from the material world, eventually to find some sort of liberation, which he calls kaivalya, which is aloneness or isolation. So for him, yoga is not union, not at all. We're going to come back to the Bhagavad Gita, which is kind of around the same time-ish as the Yoga Sutra. But we'll come back to that because I really like the practical teachings of the Gita. I want to finish with those. I'll go forward a little bit towards the Hatha Yoga period, which is the medieval period. And the Hatha Yoga is a really big influence on what we do now, because they start to work with the body a little bit more. And so it's a little bit more recognizable to modern postural yoga. And in this text, the Yoga Bija, it says here, yoga is defined as the unification of the many pairs of opposites. such as the unification of in-breath and out-breath, as also one's blood and one's semen, the unification of the sun and the moon, or unification of the individual soul with the supreme soul. So that's probably a bit more recognizable. Interestingly, it said unification of the many pairs of opposites. I really like that because my experience of yoga has been that yoga shows you that paradoxes are not as simple as they seem. That the world is paradox, and actually when you bring opposites together, it reflects the truth quite a lot better. It's like, when you stop trying so hard, you actually manage to achieve the things you want to achieve. And Patanjali himself actually says this in chapter 2. He says that when you practice asana, when you practice the seat, which then became postural yoga, is called asana. He says that if you practice asana, then you transcend the pairs of opposites. Certainly, I have that experience that if you do a pose, you start to feel how you can be reaching in both directions at once, how you can be letting go and holding on at the same time, how you can be feeling effort as well as release. And so in that way, it's quite a recognizable and practical definition of yoga, the union of the pairs of opposites. If you go a little bit later into the tantric period, yoga starts to mean the union of you, the practitioner, with the deity that you're working with. Like it would be like you becoming one with Shiva, for example. And that's certainly something that people still practice today. Now, I'd like to go back to the Bhagavad Gita, as I said, because it's such a beautiful text and is full of practical advice. Whereas Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is for ascetics who are living out in the mountains in a cave and meditating all day long and not necessarily having to deal with the practicalities of everyday life. Certainly, if you practice with the Yoga Sutra, there's a lot of stuff that you can apply to life now, and I find it very helpful. But the Bhagavad Gita is even more so. It really is about wrestling with the reality of trying to be harmonious while still living in the world. Paradox, if you will. So the Bhagavad Gita has several definitions of yoga. It has the word yoga throughout the text. It's certainly a yoga text. And in chapter 2, the first one we get is Samatvam yoga uchyate. Yoga is equanimity. So that means that when you meet the good and the bad, you respond in the same way. You're completely balanced and equal. Just a couple of verses later, yoga karmashu kaushalam. Yoga is skillfulness in action. What's that got to do with union? What's that got to do with the mind? Skill? Well, if you actually manage to do as Patanjali suggests and get your mind to quiet and slow the whirlings of your thinking, then you'll probably notice that the stuff you've got to do becomes a little bit easier. If you're not overthinking and always like in an anxious of your mind, then you might find that actually you can apply yourself and your abilities and your powers to the tasks at hand in a much more easeful way. Now, I wanted to come to the pinnacle of this little speech, which is in chapter 6 of the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna says, he defines yoga again. Let it be known that the unlinking of the union with suffering is known as yoga. Tam vidya dukkha samyoga viyogam yoga samnitam. So here he uses the same word as Patanjali in chapter 2. Patanjali said that the cause of suffering is the samyoga, the strong linking of you with the material world. And here again, it's about the strong linking, the attachment to pain. And you would think like, oh, I don't want to be attached to pain. I'm not attached to pain. I don't like pain. But actually, how many times have you ever held on to a grudge against someone? Have you ever stayed in a huff when you could totally have forgiven someone for what they were doing? Or have you just allowed yourself to get upset when you didn't really need to? This is something I'm trying to practice lately, is instead of allowing myself to be upset or annoyed by whatever it is, I'm trying to just soften away from it and let go of it and notice that we cling to our own suffering. We really do, because it's familiar, because we think that it makes us who we are. But actually, when we practice yoga, we start to realize that we could be so much bigger. If we V-yoga, if we disconnect, unlink from our connection with pain. So here again, yoga is an unlinking. It's a disentangling, it's a liberation from pain. But how do we make it happen? If we go all the way back to the beginning, to the Katha Upanishad, as Krishna says again and again, it's all about bringing the senses together, controlling your senses. Controlling your senses, bringing your awareness in by linking your awareness to your breath or to Krishna or to whatever you're focusing on. That allows you to unlink from your suffering and unlink, or as they say nowadays, let go of what's no longer serving you. So in to wrap it all up, we can see that yoga is union. Yoga isn't union. Yoga is finding a harmonious way of living by trying to create a balance between opposites. Of course, it is both union and not union, because we understand that the world is paradoxical, and yoga reflects the world right back at us and says, look here, see if you can stand somewhere in the middle. Can you unlink from linking? And can you connect? Can you link yourself to unlinking? Plenty to think about. So I hope it's given you something practical to consider or to work with in your own life and in your own practice. And I'll see you again next time. Om Shanti.